During Session 1, the Protestant Reformation and the ensuing political and religious upheavals during the 16th and 17th century in Europe were explained, with special emphasis given to England. How these turbulent times led to the splintering of the Roman Catholic Church's power and position on the European continent were described. The development of two distinct groups of dissenters who would eventually journey to the vast unknown territories of the New World were considered. The first were the Puritans, who wanted to reform or purify the Church of England. They would eventually settle the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The second, a more radical group, were the Separatists, who felt that the Church of England was totally corrupt and beyond repair, and perceived a need to establish a completely new religion. The Separatists would settle the Plymouth Colony in 1620, 20 miles south of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was established in 1630. Both groups suffered religious persecution at the hands of the established church. The Separatists would first flee to the more religiously tolerant Holland in 1608, and later in 1620 depart on the Mayflower for the New World. The Separatists, as mentioned, established the Plymouth Colony and a new religion known as the Congregational faith. The two colonies would merge in 1691 after the Massachusetts Bay Colony adopted the Congregational religion. The founding of this religion would later have a direct and significant impact on the history of the Bristol, Forestville area. In 1636, the Reverend Thomas Hooker, known as the founder of Connecticut and the father of American democracy, traveled the Connecticut River and settled in what is now Hartford. It is truly ironic that he left the Bay Colony because of religious persecution and lack of political participation. These were the same basic reasons why the Puritans left England. Citizens from Hartford soon saw a need for greater farming territory and traveled the tributaries of the Connecticut River to the junction of the Farmington and Pequabic rivers and settled amongst the friendly Tungus Indian tribe. Life with the Native Americans in this area was described, as well as their use of the land west of the Farmington Center, known as the Great Forest or the Westwoods. Session 2 will discuss the first permanent home established in the Bristol, Forestville area by Ebenese Barnes in 1728. Other significant settlers will also be mentioned. The difficulties, challenges, and needs of the early settlers who journeyed through the Westwoods will be described. The eventual break or separation from Farmington and the reasons which necessitated this will be looked at. Another section will be devoted to the significant impact that the French and Indian War had on our striving for independence. The War of Independence, or Revolutionary War, and the ensuing struggles between local citizens and religions, whether to completely separate or to remain as a British colony. The final section will view Bristol as it emerges as a town in 1785, with a subsequent reduction in power of the Congregational Church hierarchy. The turmoil on the European continent, as well as other areas of the world, continued during the 18th century as England attempted to maintain its current holdings while striving to expand into new territories. Separated by time and distance, the colonists nevertheless were exposed to the controversies and needs of its mother country. The settlers were considered English citizens, and subject to their control and needs. Sponsored through royally approved charter companies, they were assisted, but were also used by England to acquire financing and resources that were desperately needed at home in England in order to continue its expansion around the world. England's actions oftentimes placed it in conflict with its own citizens, as well as with other countries with similar expansion goals or who desired to remain free and independent. The turbulent and changing political climate in England continued throughout the 17th century. King Charles II, in 1662, in an unexpected and remarkable event, granted a charter that officially recognized the colony of Connecticut. Probably as a vengeful action, the colony of New Haven lost its separate existence and was merged into the Connecticut colony. The New Haven colony had shown allegiance and support for a rival political leader, which brought them in strong disfavor with Charles II. Very soon after, however, the royal government began to exert its authority in a more aggressive manner. The Connecticut colony felt that its charter was in danger of being revoked. A famous story, probably more interesting and romantic in nature rather than historically documented, is that the charter was hidden in a large oak tree, which became known as the Charter Oak. The Connecticut settlers felt that the titles of the vast territories which they held would become more secure from seizure if it was granted out to particular settlements and assigned to individual ownership. There was a strong, swift, and definite movement by the colony to place the lands in the hands of individuals before the charter could be dissolved. The General Court of Connecticut, as part of this effort, granted extensive tracts of land between 1673 and 1674 to Farmington. This included the land ceded to the colony by the Tungus Indians. This grant included the land that would eventually become Bristol, Forestville, and Burlington. It would appear that the town of Farmington, our mother town, was way ahead of the curve in protecting its land from seizure. Or perhaps the wealthy were securing their own private rights and ownership of the land west of their settlement when, in 1673, the 84 prominent families, or proprietors, declared themselves a closed body, with no one else permitted to enter or share in a vast wilderness to the west. Ten years earlier, in 1663, although not officially in ownership of this territory, 4 proprietors, including Thomas Barnes, were granted 40 acres each of meadowland located in the area of Poland Brook, later known as the Pequabic River. A year later, 2 additional families were gifted 20-acre sites in the same area. Just west of the present-day King Street and Lake Avenue, the hills of what would become Bristol drop abruptly. A 4-mile-wide, continuous meadowland on both sides of the Poland Brook extended eastward until rising again quickly on the east side of Plainville. It would appear that this open meadowland had attracted the attention of some of the citizens of Farmington long before settlement was initiated. This area would include the land that would become known as the village of Forestville. These lands were again listed and granted unofficially in 1672 to the 6 designated families and called reserve lands. Thomas Barnes and the other 5 original grantees probably gave the impetus 60 years later to their heirs to begin settlement in this area, later known as East Bristol. At the age of 50, Ebenese Barnes, accompanied by his sons and equipped with essential supplies, tools, and food that would be needed, departed Farmington on horseback for the difficult journey through the untamed frontier known as the Westwoods or Great Forest. Despite his age, Barnes was well able to handle the strenuous challenges, hardships, and hard work that would face him traveling to and establishing a homestead in this rugged, uninhabited wilderness. Thomas Barnes, an original proprietor and Ebenezer's father, had been granted several times the meadowland on both sides of the Poland Brook, later called the Pequabic River. With his journey completed, flat land suitable for farming and homesteading were selected. His home would be located on the King's Highway, now King Street, at the intersection of the present-day Broad Street. This location was utilized as a primitive, rugged Indian trail extending from Hartford through Farmington and the Westwoods onto the Mattatuck Indian Territory, now Waterbury. This would later provide Barnes the opportunity to not only use his home as his living accommodations, but also as a tavern and inn, which will be discussed later as important institutions at that time. Living near rivers by settlers was extremely important and necessary for survival and growth. The Pequabic River provided transportation, water for drinking, cooking, and crop irrigation, significant and abundant fishing opportunities, and availability for trapping of animals. This would also very soon provide the water power for the development of the earliest industries in the area. As mentioned in Session 1, the 84 Farmington proprietors mapped out 6 large tiers of land, each being divided into 80 lots. Each proprietor was given land in 5 tiers, thus making their holdings in the Westwoods widely scattered. The tiers were developed regardless of natural topography, such as swamps, rivers, rock ledge, and any other physical features. Once the land was assigned to the grantees, he, or in most cases, his next generation heirs, were free to sell, exchange, or trade this land as a financial commodity. Oftentimes, a parcel of land was exchanged several times before a settlement was developed. People came from near and far to secure land ownership in the territory known as the Great Forest. Ebenezer and other settlers, usually from prominent, well-to-do families, wanted the same land opportunities as their parents, but there was little land available in their home communities. Land in the Westwoods sold for 1/4 the price in other areas, and once the forest area was cleared, was exempt from taxation for 4 years. Land was bought and sold aggressively for the next 30 years. It would appear that Ebenezer, as well as the other settlers, generally disregarded the tier allocation system that was only effective on paper. After buying or trading land, homes were established on the best available land. Homesteads were widely scattered, with roads being developed to connect these settlements. When the Congregational Church was built, roads were established for the journey to Sabbath worship. The early settlers planned their arrival into the Westwoods to afford themselves sufficient time to clear the land, begin cultivation activities for farming, and to construct a home before the onset of the harsh New England winters. With only limited supplies of essentials brought from their home communities, the new arrivals immediately began the long and tedious work of preparing for a completely new life in the wilderness. They fished the rivers for shad and salmon, trapped animals for food, their furs and pelts, and foraged the surrounding land for berries, wild fruit, and nuts as sources of food. Although doing some hunting, this was too expensive and time-consuming, thus was not utilized to a large extent. A temporary shelter was usually the first order of business. Using knowledge gained from their Native American friends, they generally built on uphill areas to avoid spring flooding, and constructed their shelter in a direction to avoid the cold north winds. The new lands that they were settling would be used to provide the basic necessities of life: shelter, food, and clothing. Forest lands were cleared and lumber hewed from the fallen trees to build their homes, barns, and other outbuildings. Neighbors generally assisted in the construction of homes and barns, as well as helping with the fall harvesting. This was a family affair, with women and children sharing in the responsibilities. Each family attempted to be as self-sufficient as possible, with farming becoming a full-time occupation. The typical New England or local farm would range from 60 to 100 acres. The largest part was dedicated to use as pasture land to feed their animals. Caring for and protecting the livestock was of major importance, as the settlers were dependent upon them for survival. A family might own 2 or 3 cows, a horse or 2, 4 or 5 pigs, as well as some sheep and chickens. Some families were also fortunate enough to own a yoke of oxen, which could be lent out to neighbors. Horses were essential for transportation and were oftentimes used to till the ground during the planting season. Oxen, if available, were also used for plowing the field as well as performing heavy hauling. Cows provided milk, with the excess made into butter and cheese, a strong staple in a colonial home. They were also used for their meat. Sheep provided the wool for making clothing and bedding, while pigs provided a meat supply. Chickens supplied eggs as well as being utilized as a food source. A variety of cultivated crops were grown for both family and animal consumption. Ground corn, wheat, barley, and rye provided the essentials for bread, muffins, and johnny cakes, as well as food for the livestock. Hay fields were also used to feed the livestock. A wide variety of vegetables and herbs were also grown. The herbs were not only used to season food, but were also used for medical purposes. Apple orchards were developed as quickly as possible, with apples stored in large wooden barrels for wintertime consumption, or pressed into cider to be used at a later time. Each family usually owned a beehive, which provided honey for sweetening and cooking. Families also tapped into trees to make their own maple syrup. The farms developed from the tier system were oftentimes spread out, with perhaps 10 to 20 acres surrounding the dwelling, with other fields and orchards scattered throughout the territory. The settlers attempted to provide everything for themselves, including pickling of vegetables and salting or smoking of meat, which was essential for the long winter months. The reality, however, was that it was virtually impossible to be totally self-sufficient. Neighbors were highly dependent upon each other and frequently exchanged food, tools, oxen service, as well as settlers oftentimes hiring themselves out for service. Families generally owned a large spinning wheel and a smaller flax wheel for processing wool and flax, but quite oftentimes needed the services of a neighbor's loom to weave the coarse cloth that they desperately needed. This, however, was not a barter economy in which you received something in payment. Account books were kept by each settler, which details were recorded of each loan or service. The settlers would annually review these transactions between parties to recognize what each had contributed that year, but no exchange of money nor goods was expected. They were simply learning good business techniques and recognizing the equity or lack thereof of their transactions. A variety of circumstances required the long journey back to the wealthy community of Farmington. Ebenezer and the other settlers desired, but were also required by the Congregational Church to attend Sabbath day worship services. They were also responsible to provide their children with an education. Being distant citizens of Farmington, they felt it was extremely important to have their voice heard at town meetings, as well as to exercise their voting privileges. Food items not grown at home, and desired items such as additional livestock, furniture, pewter, ceramics, and tobacco would have to be purchased either in Farmington or Hartford. They would also bring their grain to be ground into meal at a Farmington grist mill. After traveling back and forth for a decade, giving or taking 2 years, the first rudimentary industries in the area, based upon the basic needs and necessities of life, began to appear. True signs of an independent community attempting to become self-sufficient were being seen. The development of the initial business in the area was commencing. The first industries were located along rivers with naturally falling water, or where timber or stone dams were built to create an 8-foot drop that would turn a large wooden water wheel. Through a series of attached gears and cogs, movement was generated to produce the desired work. 3 mills developed near the Barnes homestead on the Pequabic River. The first, built as early as 1739, was owned by William Barnes, Ebenezer's son. The Pequabic River for years would become known as the Mill River because of the cluster of mills situated there. The grist mill was the most critical of the emerging businesses. Here, corn and grain would be ground into cornmeal and flour, used both for food preparation and animal consumption. The miller initially received a portion of the ground materials, but later instituted a per bushel fee. The first grist mill, built in 1741, was located on Down Street at the intersection of today's Memorial Boulevard and Riverside Avenue. Only a small amount of grain was processed during each visit because the ground materials tended to spoil quickly. Settlers came back often. As a result, the grist mills became a place to meet and socialize. Public notices were required to be posted on the mill doors, and they, like the taverns and meeting houses, became important community centers. The miller's position was so important within the community that he was oftentimes exempt from military duty or community road building. A sawmill and a fulling mill were located near the grist mill. The sawmill, in addition to supplying lumber for houses, barns, and other outbuildings, provided clapboards and shingles for the New England-style home. It is a misconception that the early homes were built as log cabins. The reality is that they were framed wooden structures. The sawmill also provided wood for farm tools, utensils, wheels, bridges, sleds for the wintertime, and water wheels for supplying power. As mentioned earlier, most homes owned a large wheel for spinning wool and a smaller flax wheel to process the flax fibers. The cloth made at home was very rough, loose, lumpy, and contained open spaces. At the fulling mill, after wetting the fabric, it was pounded with hammers, pressed, and then stretched on a frame or rack and left to dry. The cloth taken home was soft and full, without spaces, thus the name fulling mill. William Barnes built the first mill of this style near the site of the eventual grist mill in 1739. Two other early industries, more scattered throughout the area because they did not depend on water power sources, were blacksmith shops and tanneries. Blacksmith shops were essential for shoeing of horses and oxen in order to keep them in good shape for their crucial work. These shops also produced farm tools and other metal instruments as needed, in addition to repairing broken metal items. Tanneries use chemicals gathered from trees and plants to soften and preserve the stiff leather or hides of animals so they could be processed into comfortable shoes, boots, and leather clothing. Attendance at the day-long Sabbath day religious services was not only a strong desire by the settlers, but also an obligation imposed by the Congregational faith and Connecticut state law. Everyone was expected to attend unless sick or otherwise excused. Very little else, including travel, was permitted, and non-attendees and offenders were fined. With the advent of industry within their settlement, it became less necessary to return to Farmington, except for religious worship services. Traveling the time-consuming 9-mile journey by horseback or on foot over barely passable former Indian trails, oftentimes in total darkness and with unknown dangers lurking within the forest, presented an extreme hardship. The harsh New England winter months and the muddy spring flooding season proved extremely difficult. The settlers with Ebenese Barnes, the first signer, petitioned the State General Assembly that they be granted winter privileges and be able to hire a minister to preach locally 6 months out of the year. A winter society was granted on October 14, 1742. Officers were elected on November 8th to organize the society and to hire a preacher. What a joyous occasion it must have been when 20 families crammed into the small home of John Brown for the very first local religious service on December 6th. Brown's home was north of the Barnes home on the east side of the King's Road, the eventual Forestville side of King Street. Very soon after, the settlers sent a committee to Farmington and again petitioned the General Assembly. This time they requested that they might become a distinct society separate from their mother town. Farmington had already consented, and permission was quickly granted by the state. The new society would become the New Cambridge Ecclesiastical Society. The area had previously been known as Cambridge. With privilege comes responsibility. The society was now obligated to hire a minister, provide education for their children, and to pay taxes to support both institutions. New Cambridge was 5 miles square, with a geographic center located at the present Federal Hill Green. This area was selected as a site for a church or meeting house. A formal Congregational Church was formed in 1746, and a small meeting house constructed the following year. In 1770, a larger meeting house was built. Today's First Congregational Church was built in 1832. The hiring of a minister to first serve the Congregational Church would become a major source of contention. The formal beginning of religious services at the meeting house, instead of uniting the community, began with a division and separation of its members. This would have significant impact within our city's history. The second obligation required the education of the society's children. The first schoolhouse, or academy, was started very near the meeting house in 1754. Forestville, when formed, would eventually be the site of one of 3 academies located within the community. Although officially incorporated in 1746, and having searched for a pastor since 1744, a contentious period of 3 years regarding the installation of Reverend Samuel Newell delayed the process. Others had been considered, but were not selected. The choice always circled back to Reverend Newell. Newell's separatist and congregational style of preaching, based on admonitions, fear, punishment, and public confession of sin, as well as his strong disdain for the Anglican Church of England, was not acceptable to all church members. Several settlers, especially those from Wallingford, who were living in the Chippens Hill area, felt an allegiance to the Church of England's ritualistic and sacramental philosophy. They were also growing tired of the Congregational Church monitoring their life, and they derived little joy within their faith. During this time, in the late 1730s and 1740s, a great awakening was taking place in all of the British American colonies. The series of emotional religious revivals gained an especially strong foothold in New England. 2 of the luminary Protestant preachers were George Whitefield, an English itinerant preacher, and Jonathan Edwards. Their preaching stressed individual decision-making based on conscience and made from the heart, rather than coming from strong pulpit fear. Faith and the relationship with God was viewed as an energetic, personal, emotional, and based on their own interpretation of the Bible. The revival stressed a merciful God, a need to reinvigorate life, and the equality of all people. The Great Awakening not only altered religious practices and beliefs, but was also changing the American social order and how people interacted with each other. The face of the religious community, as well as the feeling of individuals' dignity, rights, and empowerment, were rapidly altered. Signs of the demise of the Congregational Church as an instrument of government with its powerful hierarchy were becoming obvious. Dissenters from the established religion were strengthened. These feelings probably contributed to a subsequent split with the Congregational Church when Pastor Samuel Newell was appointed in 1747. The changes made during the Great Awakening would also have a considerable influence, as will be seen later, surrounding the War of Independence. When Mr. Newell was hired as pastor in 1747, a formal revolt occurred in which at least 8 families quit the meeting house and declared themselves of the Church of England and under the Bishop of London. Several other families would quickly join the Episcopals, who were also known as Tories. A small church was erected and a cemetery was built in the same year, across from the Congregational Church. The church was located where the former Thomas H. Patterson School was located and where the Patterson Apartments are presently situated. A minister's service was soon acquired. At first, the dissenters were obligated to pay the ministerial fee for Pastor Newell. When they refused to pay, even their pastor was jailed. Learning to be assertive, they argued their case at the Connecticut General Assembly. They were granted dispensation from this assessment and now could compensate their own pastor. The two congregations coexisted near each other for over 25 years, but as will be seen later, this relationship could not endure and would even become extremely violent. The community continued to change. The Barnes homestead, located on the Kings Road at the Broad Street intersection on the old Colonial Road, was added to twice, both on the north and south end, each of which contain a brick chimney. The original center structure has a larger plaster and stone chimney. As transportation improved and as the local industries developed, the Barnes family decided to use their home as a tavern and inn. Taverns were designated by either a sign with a tin ball and decanter or a foot glass with a punch bowl. Taverns and inns were extremely important community institutions. Prior to newspaper, out-of-town news was brought by travelers staying the evening. Early settlers could only travel about 6 to 8 miles a day under primitive conditions, and on a Sabbath day, non-religious travel was forbidden. The inns provided lodging, meals, local beverages such as beer and cider, and imported West Indian rums, as well as providing stabling and feeding of their horses. Public notices were required to be posted on the tavern door, and post riders delivered mail to the inn because there was no postal system. Locals came to read notices, get their mail, and to learn about news from distant places. News might be outdated, but at least the world was opening up to them. As roads became more passable, stagecoaches brought larger groups, and teamsters hauling loads spent the night at the inn before continuing on to the New Haven seaport. The Pierce family from Southbury purchased the land, tavern, gristmill, and sawmill in 1795. They continued the tavern business until 1835. 5 generations of the Pierce family lived here, including Julius E. Pierce, who bought into a Lake Compounds partnership with the Norton family. The Pierce homestead was later utilized as housing for Bristol brass employees. After 211 years of being owned by only 2 families, but falling into serious disrepair, the house was demolished in 1939. The American Clock and Watch Museum's newest wing, the Ebenese Barnes Memorial Wing, includes the truss and paneling saved from the Barnes or Pierce homestead. 2 of the world's greatest imperialistic nations, Britain and France, conflicted simultaneously head-to-head on both the European continent and in colonial America, beginning in 1754. The French and Indian War, the Americans' portion of the European War, which began in 1756, was so named because the French were allied with several Native American nations. In Europe, the 7-Year Wars from 1756 to 1763 included most of the major European powers. The root cause of the French and Indian War was the conflict over the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes area. This land was on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains. The French valued this region with its rich resources and cherished their significant fur trading business, which was centered here. Unlike their British counterparts, they had little interest in inhabiting this territory. The Native Americans living here were eager business partners with the French and had a strong disdain for the British, who had pushed them west while settling the East Coast. The British wanted to begin trade with the Indians in this area. As a consequence, the French built forts to prevent the British incursion into their perceived territory. Neither side was willing to compromise nor negotiate, which led to war. The Native Americans in this area sided with the French because of their hatred for the British. The British colonists would be supported by their motherland and the Iroquois Indian nation. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended both the French and Indian War and the European 7 Years' War. This document virtually ended the French power in America. Britain received all Canadian holdings and was ceded all of the New France territory from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. Spain, who had assisted France, lost Florida to Britain, but was given Louisiana. This would allow Britain to expand its holdings and settlements into the Mississippi Valley. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, was the beginning of the end of British rule in what would become the United States. Officially claiming the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, he ceded it as hunting ground to the adversarial Native Americans who had assisted the French. This move was directed at placating a strong opposition, but it completely angered the colonists. They viewed this as a means of controlling them and limiting their opportunities. They, in short terms, felt disrespected. Colonists, according to the proclamation, could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, and those who were there were required to move back east of the mountain chain. When the royal crown began with several acts that they considered taxation without representation, the colonists, emboldened by the Great Awakening and by the participation and learning that they acquired during the French and Indian War, were ready to engage in a historic movement that would startle the entire world and would cause a dramatic and disastrous struggle within our community. This is where Session 3 will begin.